This is not quite as complicated as creating the world in 6 days, but it's pretty close. Our speaker, if you weren't with us the first week, is Dr. Brendon Benz, who is professor of religion. His area is Hebrew Bible or Old Testament or Hebrew Scriptures, whatever you want to call it, at William Jewell College, and he's also with the Center for, what is it, Faith and Culture?
Faith and Culture.
Faith and Culture. I thought that was right, but it sounded wrong when I was saying it. So please welcome back Dr. Benz.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It's really great to be here. Okay, so the great thing about talking about these topics is that we can go anywhere we want, which is fun, for me at least. But any reflections on our conversation last week? Thoughts, concerns? Yes.
Not concerns, just how difficult it is to identify with absolute certainty any translation. I personally hope that Mike can tell us he's got the absolute understanding now that there's a new translation. We know everything about the Bible. But just, the absolute certainty is never there. And then the interpretive ability for people with different basic views of religion to take whatever is there and say, yes, it means this. And my favorite example of this is when Jesus said to the disciples, the poor you'll always have. I think what he was saying is, you could talk to these people next week. I'll be dead in terms of you. I'll be gone. Rather than, yes, the poor are here and we should leave them here.
Yeah.
They're irredeemable. So that uncertainty about the translations and then the ability, no matter what the translation, of people to use it for A, B, C, or D.
Is that possible?
No, it
good.
isn't possible, but
Okay.
you're right, it's not possible. But we could all agree on the original language in which the Bible was written and use a common approach to that information.
We could.
Rainy afternoon.
Here's a fun, this happened in class today. We were reading Judges 9. So Judges, right, it's set after Joshua. Israel comes and takes the land. And then there's all these different stories about what Israel is doing in the land.
Right.
And you remember Gideon, he has his exploits from Judges 6 to 8. And at the very end of the Gideon cycle, or the Gideon story, the people come to Gideon. What do they want to make him? Do you remember? They want to make him king, right? And he refuses because he's pious. And he says, God, that's exactly right. And so that's the theme, that's the narrative. And even Samuel, who's the last judge in the book of Samuel, wrestles with God, and he says, it's so sad because the people want a king, and God says, it's okay, it's not your fault, I'm going to give them a king. But there are competing narratives because there's also pro-kingship thoughts in there. So here's what happens. That's what the Bible tells us about Israel's history. And now an interpreter or a translator comes, and they translate Judges 9. And Judges 9 revolves around a guy called Abimelech. Abi means my father. Melech, of course, means king. And so his name literally means my father is king. And he is elected, actually. He is given kingship by the people of Shechem. And he's referred to as a Melech, as a king. But the translators interpret or translate Melech in the Hebrew Bible as prince. Do you get it? Now, it's a decision. And I asked my class, I don't know what went through the translators' minds, but is that decision partially predicated on the notion that the Hebrew Bible is giving us, which then, prevents us from seeing other possibilities? Follow? But then absolute certainty is fun because in Daniel, Jeremiah 25, I was starting to talk about this last week. Jeremiah 25, Jeremiah is writing during the Babylonian exile, which we'll talk a little bit about today. And the people have been taken from their land They've lost their polity, they've lost their homes, they've lost potentially their God, right? It looks like Yahweh was defeated. And Jeremiah says, don't fret. In 70 years, you'll be able to return home, so build houses, start businesses, etc. And sure enough, 70 years, the people return home, almost exactly. And they begin under the leadership of Nehemiah rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, right? Okay. The author of Daniel, who's writing, the book is set during the Babylonian exile, but it's being written during the Greek occupation, some 400 some years after the Babylonian exile. And so the author is really responding to the terror of the Greek occupation, and it was horrible. You can read Maccabees, and it talks about some of the murderous things that Antiochus Epiphanes IV does to the Jewish people, including cleaning up the temple and then sacrificing a pig, a swine, dedicating it to Zeus, which is the abomination that causes abominations, right? And the author's trying to figure this out. What's going on, God? You delivered us from Babylon, and now we're going through what seems to be just as bad circumstance. He says he's meditating on Jeremiah 25, and the angel Gabriel comes to me and says, and explains the text to me. And Gabriel says, it's not 70 years, but it's 70 weeks of years, or 490 years. Until the suffering ends. So what you have in the Bible, this is fascinating, is a reinterpretation of the text within the text. You follow that? Mm-hmm. And the author's not saying Jeremiah was wrong. No, Jeremiah was right there. And now God is speaking to us again here, right? And so which one is right? And of course, this happens all the time with the prophets and how we Christians reinterpret, for example, Isaiah in light of the Messiah coming. Isaiah is thinking about Hezekiah. That's who he's thinking about. This young child, he'll grow up and he'll save us, which he kind of did from the Assyrian assault. But then the later New Testament authors pick that up, it's better than me, and they say, yes, Hezekiah, but also Jesus, right? That's what I love. So the Hebrew Bible tells us, don't be certain. You know what I mean?
I do, and what I should have said was, I wish we could, in fact, agree that the uncertainty can be tied to the original languages and can be evaluated in a way that doesn't say, this is black, this is white, never the twain shall meet.
That's exactly right.
But I've had a really stressful day at work where I'm trying to convince people to do things that they don't
But
do.
you said a
here I
word
am.
last week at the end of class. It was like conversational or dialogical or something like that. Do you remember that?
Discourse, the Bible,
Discourse.
yeah, I said that I think of the Bible as discourse, and we often look at it as an absolute occurrence. But I am definitely letting my day impact my interpretation.
As you should. As did the author of Daniel.
Yeah, so,
Right.
I'm in good company at least.
Yeah. You are. Think about that. Which one is the right depiction of creation?
Yes.
Yes. Exactly. Or maybe neither. Maybe neither for the context in which we find ourselves now, right? And the beauty is they stand side by side. And the authors weren't stupid. The editors weren't dumb. They knew about the conflicts. They knew that in Genesis 1, humanity was created on the sixth day. In Genesis 2, half of humanity was created before the garden was planted, before the animals were made, before the other half of humanity was created, right? This is clear to them. Completely different depiction with different purposes. And that's where we get into that discussion of fact versus myth, right? And how myth, in the good sense of the word, points to something, remember my Valentine's Day poem, points to something much more real than that which I can put my finger on. And what I love about that is that also prevents us from doing violence to the text doing violence to God and doing violence to other people. This is why God says you can't cast an idol of me. Once you cast the idol, you can control it. I'm with you. Absolute certainty, no way. Other thoughts? You sure you want to do an hour? Yeah.
Just a question, or maybe an observation, I don't know which, because I don't know what I'm talking about. But most of the Hebrew texts that we had until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered were actually Hebrew writings that came from translations, Aramaic or some other.
Many of them were, and we still have, though, 2 relatively intact texts that date to around 1000 Common Era, around there, that are presumably copies of copies of copies of copies. And their consistency can be seen in, and also their divergences can be seen in comparison with some of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
But we had no ancient.
Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest one, that's right. Yep. And those are partial. So,
What time did they go to?
150 BCE to 150 CE around there, or a little earlier than that, 70, really, actually. Is that right, Mike?
That sounds good.
It's crossing the switch from Common Era or before Common Era. So it's thought that John the Baptist, or some have said John the Baptist may have been part of these ascetic groups that were kind of collecting the texts and copying them and to preserve them in light of the Roman Empire and the impending doom that they saw happening, and perhaps the return of the kingdom. So, Qumran community, maybe it's around 200. Okay. Other thoughts? So we're going to do a little bit of source criticism. Mike says you all have kind of talked about source criticism in the past, yeah? And then a little bit of historical or contextual criticism, and then always return to confessional readings. And I said last week that there are some who think, and even Brettler, if you were able to look at those articles, suggests that these 2 don't conform to this one. And I fundamentally disagree with that. I think the more we do this, the more we can have or the richer our confessional readings can be. Does that make sense? And too often people are afraid of doing this because it's going to call us into question. And the more I've done that, I think you'd agree, Mike, the more my faith and my confessional understanding increases and grows. Does that follow? Okay.
Brendon, I don't think we're seeing online what you have on your board there.
Right, so it's just 3 phrases. One is source criticism, the second is historical and contextual criticism, and the third is confessional readings. Here, I'll put them right here, as I should have probably done. Okay, we'll go through these. Anybody remember what the traditional sources are? Because we want to review these so that we can look at Genesis 1 in particular and try to determine what the source may be, if that follows. Anybody remember what the traditional sources for the Hebrew Bible are?
Is that before the priestly and Deuteronomy?
Good.
And Yahweh and what was it?
Very good. So the J source is the Yahwist, working off the German. E source is the Elohist. E source, priestly. G source, Deuteronomic. Okay. What distinguishes the J and the E?
Words for God.
That's exactly right. That's the primary one, the words for God. So in your English translation, The J source is going to be marked by God being referred to as that small caps Lord. And that's the occurrence of Yahweh, or the divine name in the Hebrew Bible. All of that. So that's how you can know that Yahweh is being used. In the E source, God is referred to as Elohim. The J source, some suggest that it was written in Jerusalem, perhaps the oldest source, the E source in Israel, after the division of the kingdom between Jerusalem and Israel, or Judah and Israel. All of that makes sense. I'm gonna shake things up a little bit. This probably don't really exist. What it probably was, more and more people are agreeing that we just have texts, we have traditions, we have stories, and there's not a single school that collected all of these. But we have a library. And for example, when Samaria fell to the Assyrians in 721, there was a wave of refugees into Jerusalem, and they brought with them, of course, their traditions and their texts. And these texts were gathered together, and the Judean authors, both before and after the exile and during, began to collect those into a common history. Does that follow? Placing these things together. So this is too neat for probably what happened in reality. Follow? These two schools, however, seem to be authentic. Anybody know what designates or how we can determine if a priestly school, or if it's from the hand of a priestly school, a text? So priests are really concerned with genealogies. They're concerned with numbers. They're concerned about holidays, festivals, sacrificial practices, and some temple, that's right, and legal codes.
And conformity to all of those things.
Conformity to all of those things, and the view of God being transcendent deity. The theory is that the priestly school was really operating during the Babylonian exile and post-exile, trying to solidify the identity of a people that faced a severe existential crisis. Does that follow? That does not mean that all the legal codes were written at that time. There could have been very old legal codes. There are calendars within the Hebrew Bible that don't correspond, which suggests that these different calendars were brought together. But at this time, they're bringing these texts together and these ideas to solidify our identity. Who are we in the face of crisis? Makes sense? The Deuteronomic Code, or the second law, Deutero being second, of course, Nomos being law, the second law was likely began to be put together during the reign of Hezekiah. After the Assyrians defeated Samaria in 721, refugees came to Jerusalem, and then Hezekiah is confronted with the problem of the Assyrian assault. And Hezekiah is standing in Jerusalem, and he's watching the countryside fall to the Assyrians at around 701 BCE, so about 20 years after Samaria fell. And the things that are emphasized in the Deuteronomic Code that are new are worship only in Jerusalem, no high places, and a strong emphasis on Yahweh alone. And some have argued that Hezekiah is standing on the city walls watching the countryside burn, and what's burning with the countryside? All of the high places in those local towns, right? All of the idols that might have been there. Even if they were idols or figures dedicated to Yahweh, they're being burned. And Hezekiah and his people are thinking, what's God communicating to us right now? That the real place to worship is in Jerusalem. And that all of these symbols associated with Yahweh, we can't do that anymore. Does that make sense? Okay. So, if you think about Genesis 1 in particular, we've already determined that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are two different authors. Genesis 1 uses a different name for God than Genesis 2. There's a different word for create, if you read the Brettler articles, than there is in Genesis 2. So what source might the Genesis 1 come from? Get that? What's being emphasized?
Calendar.
Calendar. Where did you see that, or how did you see that?
The seventh, first day, seventh day.
Yeah. In fact, the seventh day, the establishment of what? Sabbath, right? Important.
Right.
Calendar. God places the stars in the sky to mark what? According to the text.
The year, the month,
Yeah.
movement.
Year, the month, the dates, the times to celebrate different festivals, right? What's God like in Genesis 1 compared to God in Genesis 2 and 3?
It's a little more remote.
Why would you say that?
Little louder.
Well, I said God was a little more remote in Genesis 1, Genesis 2. And I don't know why I said it, just that's the feeling I get when I read it.
Well, there's more interaction, it seems to me, in Genesis 1. Excuse me, less interaction. It's
Right.
all at a
Right, and
distance.
God
And-
said, and it happened. God
And
said,
in 2 and 3, he's there manipulating.
And
He's on
and
the
he
scene.
saw that Adam needed a companion.
Right.
And he saw this and that. Yeah, so there's,
It's more
he's
hands-on.
remotely speaking the earth into existence.
Yeah.
Rather than participating. So,
That's exactly right. What's that depiction of God like? We compare that with God who fashions, right? Breathes, doesn't quite know, right? In a sense, has to listen. What's the God of Genesis 1 like?
I think you used the word transcendent.
Transcendent, yes. What do you make of God speaking things into being?
Control. Omnipotent.
Yes.
For me, one of the big differences is, when in Genesis 2, when they move people up to number 1, for me, it seems to be that is indicating that God puts people above the rest of the world, and it gives those people that are in control and power more of a direct connection to God, because they were first and therefore they got. So for me, that difference seems very political
Yeah,
with
absolutely.
the little p.
Yep.
Or maybe a big P.
And yet that authority is always couched in the judgments that God makes of all of creation, which is, it is good, right? So you're exactly right. The image of God in one way can be read as divine representatives on earth to steward an earth, a creation that is good. Just as much as God sees it as good, the divine stewards, humanity, should see it as good and treat it appropriately. Excellent. Did you notice on which day the sun was created? Yeah, fourth, I
After
think.
light.
Yeah, exactly. After light, darkness. Which you've got to say, okay, we're not talking about days, right? The literalism, right? Creationism versus creation. That's this article. We're not talking about 24-hour days because we mark days with 24 hours according to the movement of the sun. No, the movement of the earth. I'm not that backwards. The apparent movement of the sun around the earth. So, what's it like? What's the structure of Genesis 1 like?
One, two, three,
Okay. Yep, that's right.
It's organic in that without the oceans and the land, we can't put people in. It's organic from a single source, you know, the water and the emerging lands, and then you can put everything on.
Good.
It seems very.
Yeah.
Before the sun.
Yep. Next day.
Separate the water. No,
That's right. Next day. I mean, we're being,
And, well, heaven,
well, yes, there's the separation, right?
right,
Heaven above and
Yeah.
a firmament above and a firmament below, right?
water was separated,
And then what?
and then land was created. In separation.
What do we see taking shape here? Once the waters are there and once the firmament above is there, what does God put there?
Well, that's the line.
Do you see this kind of symmetry that's going on as the text unfolds? Very, very orderly. To your point before, very orderly. Who likes order? What school likes order? Priests, right? Do you see where we're getting at here? This is, I think, indisputable, comes from a priestly school of thought. They're really concerned about seeing the world as an orderly thing. In spite of the disorder that exists, God created it orderly. God is a God who is above, powerful, transcendent, speaks it into being, establishes the order of the seasons, establishes the order of the festivals, and then establishes Sabbath for everyone to rest, and everything, in fact. And then Genesis 2, 3, and 4. So look at that for me. Does anybody have that text up? Because remember, as Bretler points out, Genesis 1 does not end at the end of Genesis 1, right? We also must remember putting verses in chapters is a move of interpretation. It's an interpretive move. These are much later additions. And so I'm not even sure why we ended Genesis 1 where it is, because it's pretty clear that it's Genesis 2:4 that's the end of Genesis 1. That's kind of funny. And the text says, these are the generations of the earth that God created. You follow? Again, generations, looking at things as they unfold successively, sequentially. Good? So, are we all agreed? What's the source? So what we've done, we've determined Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3 are separate, right? It's okay. Responding to two different things. Set aside Genesis 2 and 3. I don't think we can determine where that's coming from. Genesis 1, though, looks very priestly. This is important. Questions, thoughts? Everybody following? Shall we shift gears? How about the Enuma Elish?
It doesn't seem orderly to me.
It
Well,
doesn't.
I guess it is, and that it repeats things, but
Yeah.
Sir, would you repeat the question?
It's more of what. Oops. There we go. I think, but I probably not. Now. Yeah.
It's clear that should.
There's a version of the Enuma Elish. It's an Akkadian text written in Akkadian, which is cuneiform writing. I was just having a discussion. Cuneiform, hundreds of symbols, each of which have a phonetic value. And so these scribes that were able to engage in this language were, it's unbelievable, right? It's unbelievable. I mean, I have a hard enough time reading different alphabets.
So are these the 7 tablets?
You got it. These are the 7 tablets. So when you're reading the text, you probably saw a lot of brackets. Did you notice that? Very annoying. And then sometimes brackets with ... Anybody guess what that means? Yeah, it's broken off. And there are other versions that people can try to reconstruct with these ancient texts. But invariably, the most important part is where the archaeologist sent his or her axe through, right? Oh, well, that's right. Okay. Things that stand out about the Enuma Elish.
We don't have it all.
We don't have it all. That's right.
Sometimes they talk about being a woman and then they'd say he.
Okay, yeah. That's right. That's interesting. I wonder if especially in particular quote-unquote genderized qualities are being acknowledged.
And it seemed like they had different names for the same being or whatever.
Yeah, so the 7th tablet. So who's the hero of the story? Remember?
Marjo?
You got it,
But
Marjo.
he wasn't nice, right?
Well, I don't know. So here's the family tree. Tiamat and Apsu, and these are some of the signs to see. Tiamat being the female deity and Apsu, her consort, their waters mingle, and out come these other gods, right? We have the birth of the gods. And if you're familiar with Greek mythology, a similar thing happens with Kronos and his children. But what happened with Apsu's children? What do they start to become? Become unruly, right? They're loud.
They make noise.
They make noise. And Apsu just wants to sleep. And so Apsu devises a plan that he's going to kill his kids. And his his children devise a counter plan to kill Apsu, right? And that happens, and Tiamat is really angry. And it's interesting because Tiamat as water is often referred to as the god of chaos, because water is a symbol of chaos in the ancient Near East. And yet the question is, who's really at fault here? And is water just chaos? Water can also represent fertility and judgment in the ancient Near East. Nevertheless, Tiamat gathers her forces, and we have the beginning of the story. Yes, here's Apsu, Ea, one of Apsu's children, who is the god of the underworld, the god of the water, actually, the god of the water. This is a cylinder seal depicting Ea enthroned on Apsu. Okay, and so the rise of Marjo. We can think of it in terms of a few motifs, right? The first one is the threat of disorder. And where are we going to place the disorder? It's hard to know, because the generational gods were a disorder to Apsu, but now Tiamat rises up as the figure of disorder. She's threatening what should happen. She went and she stole the tablet of destiny from Enlil, the god of the heavens, and she gives it to her consort, her aide-de-camp, Kingu, right? And the non-Tiamat-sided gods need to confront Tiamat. And do you remember what happens? Great scene. A couple of gods try to do that, and they're just too afraid. They can't do it. They're too afraid. She's far too powerful. It's far too powerful. And they quake in their boots. They're The second element is this selection of a hero. So all of these primary gods, these first, second, third generation gods, they try to confront Tiamat and they fail. And who rises up? Marduk, the young god. Marduk is a god of war. He's like Baal from the Hebrew Bible, or Baal, the Canaanite god, so-called Canaanite god. He thunders in the skies. You know what thunder is. It's the chariot of Baal rolling across the clouds. You were confused when you thought it was angels bowling. It's Baal. And no, it's not an angel getting a strike when the lightning flashes, but it's Baal throwing down his lightning, just like Thor. Marduk is also the god of fertility, just as Baal is. Okay, so Marduk stands up and says, I'll do it, right? But what?
But he wants to he gets the leadership and total power.
That's exactly right. He says, if I confront her and if I defeat her, I take power. And speaking of different names, this is manifest in the seventh tablet. You are bored to tears in the seventh tablet because all of the gods were giving Marduk their names. What does that imply?
He gets all the power.
Gets all the power. Because remember, the name in the ancient world reflects your what? Who you are, your character, your authority, your power. That's right. So once you grant somebody your name, they are you. They are your power, which is a powerful statement to me. Okay, Marduk, good job. Yes, they give him divine weapons. Do you remember what his divine weapons were?
It was a bull.
Yeah, net.
Yeah.
The net and the four winds of the earth, or the winds of the four winds of the world, because there's no earth yet. And he takes those divine weapons and he goes and he confronts Tiamat and Tiamat's monsters. This is from the reconstructed Babylonian gate, some of the monsters that Tiamat made. Note what the monsters look like. They're hybrid, right? It's a distortion of order. You ever remember those biblical laws where it says you can't like knit different fabrics together or you can't breed different animals together? It's like, what the heck is that all about? Because it's distorting God's order, right? God had a certain order. Once we start doing these things, problems arise. You follow? Hybrid problems. Well, these are the hybrid monsters, figures that Tiamat has created. Marduk goes right up to Tiamat. There he is. You can see her. Him confronting her, and he nets her, blows the four winds into her, and she explodes. Tell me about the battle scene. How long does it take? Very short. To emphasize the fact that it didn't take Marduk long to defeat her, yes? He's strong. And then he begins the process of creation. Do you remember what he does to create the...
He takes her eyes and makes the Euphrates and the Tigris.
That's right, her
And he
eyes.
takes her body to make the hills, the mountains.
Yes.
And
So create, yeah.
there's more, but I can't remember.
No, that's right. The earth is the corpse of the defeated deity Tiamat, yes. And at the center of the earth, yes, he rips her in half. One half is the firmament above, and the other half is the earth. You're right, the Tigris and Euphrates. And he places Babylon, the gate of the gods, literally indicating the gate of the gods, the center of the earth. And he takes the defeated gods, and because he's such a merciful God, he enslaves the defeated gods. He doesn't dispatch them. He doesn't kill them. And they have to serve the victorious gods, right? As they sit and lounge at the gate of the gods and the earth. And after a while, the defeated gods are doing all of this work. How do they begin to feel? What's that? Used, that's right. And it's so burdensome to do this work for the victorious gods, right? As they lounge around. So Marduk comes up with a solution.
He creates people.
Marduk creates people, that's right. Do you remember what Marduk creates people from or out of? Remember old Kingu, the supporter of Tiamat, who held the tablet of destiny? He takes Kingu, who he spared, and he kills him, and he takes the blood of Kingu, mixes it with some clay, and creates humanity. And humanity is specifically created for what purpose? Serve the gods. Serve the gods. Interestingly, this occurs on the sixth Sabbath, paralleling the sixth day of creation. Okay, everybody following this? Like, give me a sense of what creation is like in this text. Like, is this a happy story?
No.
Creation from an original point of
Creation from original point of tension. That's exactly right.
and most of what happens is what happens everywhere. The victor goes the spoils,
That's right. To the victor goes the spoils.
and power and the authority.
That's right. So presumably this text was written during this Middle Babylonian period. Can you see that states? Under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar the First. At the time, Babylonian area was ruled by Kassites. He was a non-Kassite, and so he sort of usurped the throne, and he moved the capital from Kur-dur-galzu, it's a great name, to the city of, guess where? Babylon. Now, why might you write a creation narrative or have a creation narrative composed at a time when you've usurped the throne and moved the capital? You got it, right? This is propaganda. And I'm not using that necessarily in the negative word, though we're living in a world where propaganda is always negative. But this is propaganda to say, this isn't me. I, Nebuchadnezzar the First, I'm not doing this. I'm really reverting to the natural order of things, right? If you really understood creation, it was Marduk, the god of Babylon, who established Babylon as the center of reality. I'm restoring things. I'm being conservative. I'm not revolting. You follow? That's the theory. And also think about it. And all your other gods, because every town, every city in Babylon had a deity affiliated with it. All your other gods, you can pray to that god, but when you use the name of that god, who are you really praying to? Marduk, who now owns the name. This is a power grab. This is huge. Talk about subversive literature. Okay, yeah, everybody following this? Isn't this fun? Gosh, I could do this all day. Now let's put the pieces together. Review. Genesis 1 is what text? Or from what scholarly school? Priestly, good. And the priestly school likely wrote their text during what periods? Babylonian exile. Babylonian exile. And the Enuma Elish is a creation narrative of what group of people? Babylonians, okay. So you know about the exile. Again, the gate of Babylon. Babylon, this is actually an Assyrian relief. We don't have many Babylonians, but the Babylonians and Assyrians, when they went to war, it was bad, okay? You see what's in the middle of this picture here?
Oh, skull, sir.
Yeah. Heads. They'd collect heads, and they'd stack them up next to the city walls, the city gates, as a reminder that if you mess with the Babylonians, if you mess with the Assyrians, this is what's going to happen to you. Follow? Brutal. Brutal. Oh, look at this. Head heads adorning walls. They would impale people in the cities that they're conquering. Brutal warfare. This is a relief of when the Assyrians, again, I'm shifting historical periods, but this is what the Babylonians would do too. The Assyrians came and they destroyed the countryside in 701 BCE while Hezekiah is standing in Jerusalem. And this Lachish is a city in Jerusalem, and this is a relief of the destruction of the city of Lachish. And if you look closely here, you'll see this is what they did to the people. Now fast forward to 586 or around there, and the Babylonians now are taking power, and they're extending their influence all the way to Jerusalem. And while Hezekiah was able to deliver Jerusalem from the Assyrians, 140 years later, Jerusalem falls to the Babylonians. Everybody follow that? And again, what is lost with the fall of Jerusalem? The temple is lost. Who is leading the armies of Babylonians? Well, Nebuchadnezzar the second, not the first. But who really is leading the armies of Marduk? You got it. Marduk is the god of war, the one who defeated all the enemies, the forces of chaos, and took the names of the other gods. And who did Marduk defeat? Tiamat earlier, yes. And now, with the assault on Jerusalem, who does?
Yahweh.
What's that?
Yahweh.
Yahweh. And what did Marduk do with Tiamat?
Blew her open.
Open, that's right. What might the implication be that Marduk was able to do with Yahweh? Destroy.
Destroy the temple.
Destroy the temple, destroy the god, destroy your polity, destroy your land, destroy your people. This is the worst kind of existential crisis that one can face. You follow? And then you are taken to a foreign land, and you are put in the service of the king who just destroyed you. As scribes, some of them. Scribes. Now, if you're a betting person, what might you decide with regard to your identity? That is to say, I have at least two choices. One is I remain a Jew, a faithful Jew, whose every element of your identity has been destroyed, or I become what? A Babylonian. If you're anything like me, I'm becoming a Babylonian. You know what I mean? That just makes sense. But here's a group of scribes who are writing, and as scribes, they have access to what sorts of things in Babylon? Tablets. Which tablets? You got it. What's the difference between Genesis 1, or what are some of the differences between Genesis 1 and Enuma Elish?
Genesis starts with a positive creation, whereas this starts from a war.
Very good.
Conflict, and especially the destruction of a woman leader who didn't appear behind.
Genesis 1 was good. Creation was good.
Okay, let's contrast. What's that?
One God.
Okay, let's start there, and then let's go there, and then let's go there. One God.
One God.
Only one God. What's the author saying to the community of faithful?
In Genesis 1,
Yeah, with this notion that there is only one God.
that there is only one path to follow, that there is only one way, that these other gods are not real.
These other gods are not real. So when everybody was telling you that Marduk defeated Yahweh, it did. Because Marduk doesn't exist. There's only Yahweh. You get it?
Right.
There's only Yahweh. And as the prophet Isaiah goes on to say, it was Yahweh who called the Babylonians down. Because essentially you were engaging in social injustice. You weren't caring for the widow and the orphan. There's no Marduk. Okay? What was that other one? War? Who said war? Conflict.
War and conflict and aggression.
On the other side, Genesis 1, any war or conflict? Obviously. What does that say about the God of the Jews?
It's loving.
Yep. And
What he creates is good.
yes. That's right.
There's no way for them to be in conflict.
That's right. Yep. God's power is not threatened. God is the only God, and God's power is not threatened. Okay, go ahead and believe in Marduk, but that guy's been threatened. As we all know with world leaders who like to take the stage, their time is coming, right? And said, it's good, creation is good, a loving God. A God who looks at creation and says, this is good. And it's created not out of the corpse of the defeated God, right? It's created not out of the gore of battle, but it's spoken. And it's there, and it's good.
Created out of the mind of God.
That's right. God envisioned it, and it came to be, right? That's also powerful. God doesn't need materials to work with. There is the light and the darkness and the hovering over the waters, but excellent. We read on in our minds, creation's orderly, light day, light darkness, birds and fish, etc., etc. And then the kicker here, right? The kicker here, God creates humanity. What was humanity created out of in the Enuma Elish?
Your God
What's that?
created them to be servants.
Excellent. Okay, Enuma Elish created out of the blood of the rebellious deity, the blood of the rebellious deity. And Genesis 1 created as what? Or in what?
Clay.
God's image in Genesis 1,
God's
right?
image, sure.
Okay. You want to buy into this narrative of what creation is all about? You can, but it means that your identity is the spawn of a rebellious God. Or your identity is one who's created in the image of God. Just said, humanity in the Enuma Elish is created for what purpose? Service. Like servitude or doing things that who couldn't handle doing? The other gods, right? Like the defeated gods were having such a hard time doing this, and now humanity is created to do it. This is like servanthood of servanthood. This is slavery. Okay, you want to take on the mantle of Babylonian identity, then you are created to be a slave. You follow? You're created to be a slave out of the blood of the rebellious God. In Genesis 1, after God creates humanity in the divine image, male and female, God does what? This is the only words that God speaks. God does what?
It was good.
God says it's good and then very good.
Yeah.
And then right after God creates humanity, the text says God did what to humanity?
Bless them.
God blesses them. God blesses them. What a powerful statement. Think about how many times we've read over that. God bless us. God bless you. Say it all the time, right? Sneezed. God bless humanity. But in the context of the Babylonian exile, you are blessed. You're inherently blessed. And then God says, and then so God blesses them, and part of the blessing is for humanity to do what?
To multiply.
Yeah.
To multiply.
And prosper.
Fruitful, to multiply, to prosper, and to do what?
Be stewards.
Be stewards. The word subdue, right? A word misused. But now compare that, contrast that. Humanity, subdue the earth, versus humanity, be what? In the New Melish. Slaves. Be the ones who are subdued. You get what I'm saying? Be the ones who are subdued.
There's some echoes in Genesis 2, though. And we created to till the earth,
Mhm.
to till the garden.
Yeah.
So are those echoes then of the same story?
I don't think so. I think they're coming from a different school and responding to a different context. And remember, that tilling should be set in comparison or contrast with the curse in Genesis 3, where the man tills the ground and it's not productive, right? And we'll talk about more of that next week. But that, I think that tilling that God and the working of the ground that God first grants Adam, I guess, is vocation, right? It's good. We're created to work. It gives us a sense of agency, productivity, and value. So yeah, as opposed to being slaves. Well, that's a really good question. Good question.
You have to take care of the earth, not
Take
to.
care of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So think about the implications then, right? Priests and scribes, working in Babylon, they come across, or they already knew about the creation narrative in New Melish. Of course, creation narratives are important because they set the stage for what humanity is all about, right? They set the stage for what the world is about. It's a statement about the way things are supposed to be as God intended it. And this one is, you're created to be slaves on a world that was produced from carnage. Here's another option for you. This is part of your Jewish identity. This is part of your identity of faith, your Israelite identity. You were created in the image of God to serve a world that is good, and in that service you gain agency through that. Does that follow? So here's your choice, because if you're a betting man like me, I'm going to become a Babylonian. But if you want to do that, if you want to choose that, then that's the narrative by which you're going to have to align your life. That's what I tell my students. We all choose narratives by which we align our lives, right? The question is, what are the fruit of those narratives? Do we have absolute certainty about the narratives that we choose? We don't. But this is the narrative of a deity who's communicating with people in extreme existential crisis and saying, it's okay. You're good. You're okay. Stuff happens. You have messed up a little bit. Just like Adam and Eve were exiled in Genesis 3, so too sin lead to exile. But God is still there. You follow this? Does it make sense?
Marduk would have cut Adam and Eve.
What's that?
Marduk would have cut Adam and Eve.
He would have, absolutely. Or at least enslaved them.
So just retell the story of the Ukraine and
I mean, yeah, that's right. That's right. Right, so that's exactly what we're supposed to do in a sense. That's what the Bible calls us to do, is to reread the text in light of these events, in ways that give hope to a people who are being oppressed. You're not made for war. You're not made from war. Yeah.
There's no answer to it. I don't know.
I probably have it. I'm just
Do I have any idea that the Jews had any kind of oral tradition before the Babylonian exile? Was this just conceived as as almost a underground writing for the Jews to explain, or were they putting together beliefs that they had before the exile?
That's a great question. I don't think we can deny the possibility that this was circulating in the consciousness of the people before exile, right?
Yeah.
This kind of vision. But I like to think it's subversive literature, right? And again, it's not to say they didn't just make this up. I'm not arguing they made this up, right? So you're right. This is a great question. It's in the consciousness.
It came from some prior beliefs, tradition.
And it's people working through their faith in a time of crisis. Existential crisis leads to theological innovation, right? It demands communication with the divine. So the people who are going to be faithful, they're wrestling, right? And they may be taking pieces, like you're saying, from the past that they've thought about before, but this, all of a sudden, is the perfect time for God's voice to emerge and give hope to the community. That makes sense? Great, yeah.
One thing that's interesting about the Babylonian exile is that Jeremiah, before that, he was saying we're going to be carried off somewhere, and they don't. But then the other prophets are saying, "Oh no, that's not going to happen." But Jeremiah gets carried off with all the other Jews, and somehow the captain of the army or whatever, Cyrus, tells him to go find Jeremiah, and he can stay there and be taken care of by the king, or he can go wherever he wants.
Yeah. I believe he fled with his comrades to Egypt, unwillingly left. I think he was forced to leave. What's that?
That's not what the Bible says. Of course, we don't know. I mean, there are things that happen. Yeah.
Yeah, but you're right. He's writing during this time of conflict as well. Yes.
Was the concept of anthropomorphization of evil, concept of the devil and so forth, would that come back to Israel from?
That's a great question. I think the notion of Satan and the devil, as what I understand, Satan is a reflection of the Persian political appointee who was the eyes and the ears of the king. And there would be different Satans in the different provinces of the king. And they were supposed to listen in and determine whether the governors were being faithful or not. And they would be the accusers. They would go back to the king and accuse the governors of being unfaithful. So in the book of Job, right, we think of Satan as, because of later traditions, as being this bad guy for accusing Job. He's just doing his job, right? And I think that's a later development than Babylon. But I like the idea, right?
I thought maybe Zoroastrians.
That's during the Persian Empire.
So would that be after?
That would be after. So the Persians defeat the Babylonians. And that's
Persians that are the ones that send the Israelis back to.
That's right.
So they could very well be bringing back with them the Persian ideas.
That's right. Yep. And in fact, in Ecclesiastes, you have some Persian loanwords indicating that at least some of that book was written during that period. And some of these ideas are coming back with it. That's right. So Nehemiah is sent back by the king, Cyrus, to rebuild the walls. Other thoughts?
Well, we know why the Jews, or you have laid out why the Jews saw creation the way they saw. I mean, it's a better situation. How do we know that is creation?
We choose a narrative by which to align our lives.
Okay.
We choose several, right?
Yeah.
And I find that I live better, I treat people better, and I feel more connected with God, or want to feel more connected with that God, when I choose that narrative by which to align my life. You know what I mean? But that's not right. That's not necessarily how creation happened, but it's the intention behind it. That's the identity of creation. That's the identity of humanity. And I put my faith in the idea that that is a source, one of the sources of my identity. Whether it happened exactly like that. That's the worst answer in the world, I get, especially for children of the Enlightenment. Even answer.
The bad answer that you just gave is why for many of us, we don't necessarily feel an unacceptable tension between what people like Neil deGrasse Tyson do in terms of developing history versus creation. Because we know for a fact that we put the 24-hour day emphasis on creation. That didn't, there's no definitive statement that it took 24 hours times 7.
Right.
And the rest, as Bob talks about, can be one of the periods that are identified as fallow and growing. I mean, I think that that's what allows us not to have that tension between science and
Right. That's right. That's right. Try to find
I
that
want
merge.
those to be
Yep.
We do until we have some crisis in our own life. And it feels like Marduk is around us.
Yes. No, you're right.
Not that he is, but just.
Well, and then we go back to that. What even in those moments of deep crisis, and this is not we are allowed to lament, right? We're allowed to cry out to God and scream out to God and say, "What the heck is going on?" But you're right. Also, there's also a term that says, "Who do I want to be? Who do I want to be?"
Is there any comparative evaluation, wouldn't include COVID yet, but during other times of deep extreme crisis in a specific country that may or may not be a war?
Yeah.
Is there data about people returning to religion?
I'm sure there is.
Because
I'm sure there is. I mean,
it would seem to me.
Anecdotally, I would think so.
Yeah, I mean, that would be an interesting thing to know. And I think it's
so one thing I can say is that Google searches for college degrees in theology, not religion, but theology and pastoral work or something have jumped significantly since COVID. So people are returning. There is a drive. And look, we've been masked. We've been away from each other, and there's a drive for community, right? We'll talk more about this on next Monday, but think about humanity is created together. God is imaged in community, right? And so again, that's the other thing. The narrative seems to work out, right? The narrative seems to work out in these strange ways to my mind.
So what does this have to do with confessional readings?
Great question. Yeah, next week. No, but it is. But to your point back there, right? How do we reread Genesis 1 in the context of conflict, right? And the author, so we use source criticism and historical criticism to better understand what the authors were confessing at the time as a piece of subversive literature. And then what we're going to do in more of a confessional reading is we just said, and this is the Bible talking, we just said that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3 don't relate to each other, right? They're completely separate. And next week we're going to say, no, they relate to each other quite well. And if you read them in tandem and in dialogue, then some other powerful statements are made. Isn't that fun? You can do both. It's both and. And then we'll talk about the flood. Good.
Yep.
Other thoughts? This is very enjoyable. Well, thank you all.
Yeah.
You have a
Thank you.
shorter reading for